Going to do is we're going to spend some time going through our books. So let's make sure that you've got your Ted Kooser Poetry Home Repair Manual and your Mary Oliver Poetry Handbook. I hope your Mary Oliver is in slightly better shape than mine, but I can't help not want to part with it. I've had this book so long. We've been through so much. My Ted Kooser book's a little better shape, but let's try to break those bindings and really get into it today too. Let's turn to page 45 from our Kooser book. As I said in class last week, I made a little goof. I had us starting on page 42. I didn't mean that. We're starting on page 45 with Rhyming Ham Cubes Poems. And I want to start off by looking at this poem by Edward Weissmiller on page 45. And I'm going to read it to you, even though you've already read it. I want to read it out loud, and I think it's an interesting place to start. It's called Seahorse. And I'm going to read it in the way that I think is the best way for us to read poems aloud, which is hesitating on the line, but not necessarily pausing full on. The line is a tool. And we're going to talk more about the line as we go on, because the Oliver chapter is very much about that. But I want us to think about the line as being an entity unto itself. In class last time, I said something about each line needs to function in a way that makes it essential. That every line needs to do something. And so in this poem, you want to make sure you hesitate on any poem, but you want to make sure you hesitate so you can kind of see where each line is standing on its own. So Seahorse. You might think it would leap the waves in a white fire of foam, racing, eyes mad with what might be delight. A runaway, or loose from a god's team, galloping in its vast pasture. But this one was the size of a brooch, thin and red gold and still. The children had sent for it from the Atlantic. It arrived by air in a pouch of seawater containing all it needed to sustain life as it crossed the continent. Following instructions, we made it a small, nourishing ocean in which it anchored itself upright to a strand of seaweed and, staring jewel-eyed at nothing, slowly faded white and died. Now we're going to talk about the elements that Kooser talks about, but I wanted us to just kind of listen to how I read that poem to start. Do you notice that there are hesitations that I'm making? I don't want to say full-on pauses, but there are hesitations that I'm making at the end of lines, even when lines are sentences that are continuing from one line to the next. We call that enjambment. But I'm still pausing a little bit. That's allowing us to think about the word that's chosen at the end of each line. That's a really important thing. The word we choose at the end of a line is very important in a poem, because that's what we're leaving the reader with. And again, a line is a significant entity within the poem. And so you want to make sure that it starts and ends with something significant. I think it's more important to end the poem with a word that is strong. You notice in this poem that Weissmiller does not give us empty words. There are functional words within this poem, but they don't end lines as a rule. You've got words like in and be, but they're not at the end of these lines. The words at the end of these lines are waves and foam, might, delight, God's vast, one, still, it, Atlantic, sent for it, Atlantic, I think really is the way we read that, containing, continent. These are heavier words, or bigger words. The words at the beginning of the lines, you, in, racing, be, team, pasture, they're less significant, but they are working to create independent entities within the poem. So I want us to think about how we want to be measured in the way that we work our lines. And that's why it's significant when we see words that have weight at the end of each of these lines. That's a conscious thing. And that's why I pause it just a little bit. You notice I don't do it that much. Go back and watch it again. I think I did okay. And you'll see that I'm hesitating, but I'm not lingering necessarily too long at the end of each one. That's allowing us to kind of think about each line and still being aware of it. You notice also at the end of each line that is before a stanza break, and we know what these mean, right? If a line is something that exists from the beginning of the line to the next, a stanza is the sort of paragraph of a poem, for lack of a better term. That is an accumulation of lines before there's a break and then another accumulation of lines. Some poems have no stanzas, or I guess we'd say one stanza. Some, like this poem, have more than that. We've got 5 here. Now, what Kuser wants to talk about with this poem is that it rhymes a lot. And when I was giving you those end words, you noticed that there was one that was a clear rhyme that we heard, might and delight. That's a clear, direct rhyme. That's a very, very direct one. There are others that we can kind of see as like a sort of slant rhyme, an off rhyme. Sent for it, Atlantic. There's kind of a musicality to that. It kind of connects, but it isn't as direct. But if we start to break this poem down a little bit more, as Kuser does, we'll see a lot of words that are rhyming. In that first stanza, it's not just might and delight that are rhyming, but you've got another might in the first line and a white in the second line. You might think it would leap the waves in a white fire of foam, racing, eyes mad with what might be delight. But you don't hear that when you're reading it, right? Let me read that first stanza again. I know I feel badly. I told you to go back and watch it again. Now I'm just going to read it again. But that's okay. It's okay. You might think it would leap the waves in a white fire of foam, racing, eyes mad with what might be delight. You don't really hear the rhyme that directly, do you? What you're hearing is a musicality that's being created because of the rhyme, but it's not emphasizing itself. You might think it would leap the waves in a white fire of foam, racing, eyes mad with what might be delight. You can hear that might be delight a little bit, but it's not end stopped as it is in a lot of different poems that we see. So it ends up having a much different effect here, and that's significant. So what's to be gained by having a rhyming poem that the reader can't necessarily hear as clearly as we get in a lot of other places? Well, I think what happens is it does create a musicality to the poem that is impossible to ignore. And so we want to make sure that we are creating those things. Now let's talk about rhyme a little bit more. I sometimes, and I've mentioned this in class a little bit already, I get a bad rap from some of my students who say that I don't like poems that rhyme. That's not fair, I don't think. Because I do. I like rhyming poems. I like some poems that really hit rhymes. I think it's really interesting when you can make a rhyme connect in such a way that adds resonance to the poem. Here's what my concern is with rhyming poems, especially rhyming poems for us at this level when we're still figuring out our metrics and our musicality. I think what happens with a lot of rhyming poems is that we start to let the rhyme dictate the poem as opposed to the writer dictating the poem. Now, what I mean by that is that you create the first half of a rhyme on one line, and then you know you have to make it complete on the next. And so you're limited by the number of words that are available to you to complete that rhyme. That becomes a problem. So what happens often is that I'm starting to read a poem that has rhyme in it, and maybe there's one or two that totally connect, that they feel organic and natural and lovely and they fit in this world. And then there are others that don't, that are clearly, maybe the syllables are rushing to get to the right word. Maybe there's too many that suddenly appear, it gets jumbled. Maybe there's a word that is there solely for the rhyme that could easily be cut, but it has to be there because we need to accommodate the rhyme. We need to be careful with that because sometimes it does end up feeling like the rhyme is writing your poem and not you. And you should always be the one in control of the poem, the one writing the poem. And so that's why I love being able to look at a poem like this Seahorse poem, because we can see these other places where there are either rhymes or near rhymes that are helping to create this necessary musicality without compromising the meaning of the poem. As we go through on page 46, the things that are being pointed out here by Kuser, we can see other rhymes. Vast pasture, vast and past certainly rhyme. Pasture is a word that goes on a little bit past the first rhyme, but we still get a musicality from that, right? Galloping in its vast pasture. Vast is something that is a word that's ending a line. And so I hesitate on it a little bit, just a little bit, and then that emphasizes that rhyme with the first part of the word pasture too. Then we get contain and sustain, containing and sustain. And the last two lines of the third stanza, you've got upright, jewel-eyed, white, and dyed. Now, those are not complete rhymes. We know that, right? White and dyed don't actually rhyme because we look at rhymes as being exact repetitions of the sound. but it's close. There's slant rhymes. And partial rhymes, and then we get things that are even more partial rhymes with that, as he points out on 46, that instructions and oceans kind of work in that way too. So we're using harder end rhymes in places, but then we're also getting words across that are sort of creating a sound. He's referring to white and dyed as end rhymes. It's pretty close, but I probably wouldn't, but it's pretty close. And so that's why it's important for us to really play around with what rhymes can be. Rhymes do not only have to be end rhymes, complete rhymes, ending every stanza. You can do a lot of other things with it. And I want you to. I want you to play around with the different possibilities of what we have. It's fun to be able to do that. It's fun to play with different forms and different things like that. And he talks a little bit about forms. He uses the discussion about the sestina form. He talks about it a little bit on page 49. It's a form that requires the use, and this is Kuser's words at the end of 49. The sestina requires the use of the same 6 end words in a specific pattern of repetition. Writing a sestina is a whole hell of a lot of work. He's right. I've tried this. But some poets like the challenge of seeing if they can write one that turns out to be poetry and not just evidence of heavy lifting. The way that a sestina works is that you have 6 end words that you are making sure are repeated in a very formal way at the end of each line. So let's say this is the word that ends the first line of your poem, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Then your next stanza is going to begin with a very exact repetition of those words, and I'm covering it. So your next stanza will begin with the 6th word coming first, and then I'm looping my way over to the 1, and then the 5s, the 2s, the 4, the 3. You can find this information very clearly out there, and we can look for it together if anybody's interested. It's hard. It's a 39-line poem in which you have 6 stanzas in which those 6 words are repeated in a very exact fashion, and then the last 3 lines repeat all 3 of them, 2 per line on the way down. As he says, this is a whole hell of a lot of work, and then that leads us to the question is, why the hell would you want to do it? I think it's the same reason with a lot of these different types of forms, is that there's a challenge to it. There's also in poetry, there's this satisfaction with figuring out how to sort of escape a form. And I think it makes us better writers to be able to do this. I've written a lot of sestinas. Are any of them good? I think they're okay, but it's not like I've got a whole lot of published sestinas out in the world. I wrote one about tennis because I thought the word love would be a good word for a sestina. You have to have a word of your 6 words that will work on a lot of different levels. And so I picked a bunch of tennis words. Was it successful? In my own mind, it was fine, but that's about it. He provides a few because he thinks that it's a good way to kind of see the different possibilities of what we can do. And you have to choose interesting words. You have to find interesting arrangements for them. It's a challenge, and a lot of poetry is. As we've talked about already, a lot of our poems are about ways of getting to our next poem, right? That's what I was taught by one of my professors, is that each poem is only as important as the next poem that you write after that. That does not mean that you don't have great poems along the way. That does not mean that sometimes you have one poem that's really good and then the next poem after that isn't as good and then the next one is pretty good. This isn't like a forward arch so that everything is fantastically great and improving all the way through. It doesn't work that way. Instead, it is about taking chances and kind of moving our way up and developing and building. And that's what we want to do. That's why it's great to take challenges of things. I'm not going to make you write a sestina. You might want to. And again, I would suggest you look for some guidance. Just look it up online and you'll see ways of doing it. There, you've got the examples that Kuser gives us in the book, the Fairchild poem, which is a really interesting poem. And I definitely would recommend taking a look at it. And it's hard, though, because it's a form that challenges us to get things together. There's a good Elizabeth Bishop one, I think it's just called Sestina, that's worth looking at. It's great to take a look at these different forms and understand the possibilities of them. Then there is the prose poem. And you know how we talk about on that first night. We talked about the things about a poem, that a poem is something that is meant to be read aloud, except when it isn't. And poems have lines, except when they don't. And a prose poem is a form in which it definitely does not have any lines. It's a prose block. It's a paragraph. And so you wonder, what do you do with things like that? It feels like it's taking away some of the strengths that are inherent within the poetry form, the muscularity of lines and moving back and forth. Well, it's still a poem. If I'm told it's a poem, it's a poem. I've provided a link below to a reading of a poem called A Kernel by Carolyn Forche. Take a listen to it. I was going to read it to you, and I thought, if I can find a reading of Carolyn Forche reading it for us, we should do that. But take a look at it, and also I have provided a copy of the poem, so you can take a look at it that way. You can pause me for a sec and watch that, and then come back and keep that poem in check, and then we'll talk about it for a sec, okay? All right. Now, that's an amazing poem. It's such a powerful thing. Just think about the things that it's doing in this poem, that are happening within this poem, and how the prose form is benefiting this poem. There's this bombardment of images in that first half of the poem, where we're just getting buried by all the things that she's saying. It's creating the swirling effect. I think the prose poem form is benefiting us on this, because everything is piled one on top of the other. They don't get to have independent lines for us to sort of take one in, one at a time. That's fascinating. It builds up a tension. It feels like a story in a lot of ways, even if it isn't. And I think that's something that's really benefiting it too. Does that work differently, that poem, if it's broken into lines? You bet it does. And it's the form that she decided was the right one for that poem. Later today, I'm going to post up an exercise for us to do, in which we're going to take a poem, and it's a Richard Hugo poem called The Way a Ghost Behaves. And I have taken all of the line breaks out, and I've just presented it in a prose form. And I'm going to ask you to read through it and talk about what you would do with the poem if you were breaking it into lines, to emphasize the individual moments in the poem, to emphasize the movement that the poem is making and the things that it's doing. There's no right or wrong answer. There's the choices that Hugo eventually made, and I'll share them with you in class after we do this. But I want you to kind of play around with what you would want to do in those moments. And remember, we think of each line as being something that can exist on its own and contribute something for the poem. If there's a line that just isn't doing anything, then it probably shouldn't be a line by itself. Simple enough. So in the Oliver, we talk very specifically about the line in this section. And she talks very specifically about metrical verse and stresses. And we talked about this a little bit last week, but we didn't go into it in too much detail. So I want to spend a little bit of time. I think what's most important here is just knowing how we read moments like this, or read things like this, and how we kind of understand what it means to have something that is stressed and unstressed. So let's go to page 36. In metrical verse, each line of the poem can be divided into feet, and each foot into stresses. Okay. Syllable sounds to reveal the overall rhythmic pattern. This isn't just about rhyme. One of the most important forms in poetry is called unrhymed iambic pentameter. Those are lines that are not rhymed but are in a very strict form. Okay. An iambic foot, is one light stress followed by a heavy stress. The example here is upon. Now, when we say it like that, it might be hard to really take this in, but it's upon. You notice how the on is being hit harder. Upon. I don't say up on. I don't say that. And so that's the easiest way to think about how these stresses work, is to sort of say it in the opposite way. If we had it with the stress on the up and the unstressed part on the on, it becomes an entirely different word and sound. It's up on as opposed to upon, which is much more familiar for us. 5 iambic feet strung together, so 5 feet in which we have an unstressed followed by a stress, is an iambic pentameter line. As we talked about before, this is what poets have long felt most closely replicates everyday speech. Now, do we speak in iambs in normal conversation? Kind of, but not completely. Do we speak in iambic pentameter lines, where each sentence we say, or each little body of language that we speak in, is 5 iambic feet? Of course not. But it's closer than other things. So that's why when we read Shakespeare sonnets, or we read sonnets that are in iambic pentameter, it sort of sounds good. Even if we don't know what the heck it's talking about or anything like that, it sort of sounds good. Upon those boughs which shake against the cold. If we break this down, as Oliver has here, you can see how all of these are iambs. Upon those boughs which shake against the cold. Each of those, right? If we did them in the opposite way, they sound different. Upon those boughs which shake against the cold. I mean, it's hard to do, even, because it doesn't feel natural. We end up kind of doing something with it. This is the most widely used line in metrical verse. It's the line of the sonnet. It's the line of Paradise Lost. It's Shakespeare's plays. It's Wordsworth's The Prelude. It's also the line of Robert Frost. So when we talk about iambic pentameter, there's a reason we talk about it. We talk about it because it's what Frost uses. It's what Shakespeare uses. It's really, really important. Now, on 37, she provides 2 charts that talk about different types of forms. So the pentameter line is the 5-foot line, but it's not the only line. You can have 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. They're all there. This 6-foot line is the hexameter, and this, when it's purely iambic, it's called an alexandrine, and there's some poems that use this. But typically, when you see formal poems, you'd see them in pentameter, but that is not the only thing. Then there is the metrical feet and symbols. The iamb is going to be the one we've just talked about. There are also the trochee, which is the reverse. That would be up on. There are other cases in which it makes much more sense than that. The dactyl, which is a heavy stress followed by 2 light stresses. We'll talk about that. The anapest is 2 light stresses followed by heavy stress. And then the wonderful, wonderful spondee is 2 equal stresses, right? Ping pong. Very important poetic tool to have these. And that's really valuable here, to know the ways in which we can respond and use these tools. She gives us many, many different examples of lines of poetry to emphasize the different types of metrical forms here. Pentameter lines. Forlorn. The very word is like a bell. As you say them naturally, you kind of start to hear it. Right? Forlorn. The very word is like a bell. See how I'm doing it? I'm not saying in any way that's unnatural, but it's hitting those stresses. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? The shattered water made a misty din. Great waves looked over others coming in. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. So here it's tetrameter lines. This is 4 foot. And let's just kind of hear how different it is. So we've got the pentameter lines. We're still mostly dealing with iambs here, with unstressed followed by stress. Not exclusively, but we still got that. But let's see what feels different when we read these 4 foot lines as opposed to the 5 foot lines. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. Speeds it up. Can't you see it? As she says, it's only a single foot. It's only a little bit shorter, but they're really, really different. They feel faster. They feel moving. Let's get to the 3 foot line, the trimeter lines. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. That's Retke's My Papa's Waltz. You can see how here she says it gets agitation kind of getting in there. It gets so fast, it gets kind of tense. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. This is far removed from Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day. And it's even farther removed from the Alexandrine line that we're going to get next from John Keats's The Eve of St. Agnes. Awake, arise, my love and fearless be, for o'er the southern moors I have a home for thee. It kind of wanders a little, it meanders a little bit. This is so important. Now, in our poems today, we don't get as much of this strict formality. It's not something that comes as natural for us because we don't do it as much. But we could. And we do use these tools in different ways. So even though in contemporary poems you don't see as much rhyming, you don't see as much emphasis on these types of metrical forms, we still have elements of it that are in there. And I think we should. even if we're not necessarily thinking strictly in forms of iambs and dactyls and things like that, there are still these moments where we can play around with length and sounds and these different things, and I think we should. Because one of the most important things about playing with rhythmic patterns is breaking them, right? One of the most important things that we do is provide a constancy, as she talks about on 42, and then eventually mess it up. And then it comes to a real end. So on 42, on that section on constancy, the reader, as he or she begins to read, quickly enters the rhythmic pattern of a poem. It takes no more than 2 or 3 lines for a rhythm and a feeling of pleasure in that rhythm to be transferred from the poem to the reader. Rhythm is one of the most powerful pleasures, and when we find a pleasurable rhythm, we hope it will continue. She also says on 43 that language is living material, that this is something that we get drawn to, that we're pulled into, that we like, that we enjoy the way that the rhythm and the musicality develops. And eventually, as she talks about on 44, we can change things up. Lines of good poetry are apt to be a little irregular. That's okay. In fact, it's good. Some of the best moments in poetic history are variations, are things that have been set up and then we change it just a bit. Maybe it's hard to hear unless we're really looking consciously for these moments of stressed and unstressed syllables or whatever it is, but we still kind of know that something is up. So we can kind of work our way through and see how these things work. I like this example on 45. The line, this is the kind of first full paragraph that we have there that starts with but. But there are lines in which clarity simply isn't brought forth sufficiently by this method of charging the light and heavy stresses differently. There are occasions in which something more definite is called for. Consider these 3 lines from Mr. Edwards and the Spider by Robert Lowell. On Windsor Marsh I saw the spider die, when throwing into the bowels of fierce fire. But who can plumb the sinking of that soul? In the 3rd line, the iambic pattern calls for a light stress on the word that in the final foot. This makes no sense. The word itself, meaning in the poem, calls for a heavy stress, right? So let's read it again. On Windsor Marsh I saw the spider die, when thrown into the bowels of fierce fire. But who can plumb the sinking of that soul? Okay? It's kind of emphasizing things. There are accommodations of this kind of necessity called the spondee. 2 stresses of equal weight can replace the iambic foot in order to take care of compound words like heartbreak or breadboard, etc. Ping pong is the example I gave you before. Thus, the 3rd line from the Lowell can be scanned as follows, that soul can be hitting in the same way. And then there's one more line, the restrained outburst from Keats. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. The opening line of Keats' sonnet might also call for some spondee replacement if we want to, right? I'm not reading Bright Star as Bright Star. I'm reading it mostly as Bright Star because it sort of feels like they are on equal footing, and that's the way she talks about it as we go into this. So let's really think about how these things function, right? Let's go to, as you look through this, it talks about on 50, a caesura. A caesura is a really important thing that happens in a poem, and this is mentioned right after the hickory dickory dock part, which is a great example of something too. We go to page 50, that paragraph that begins, consider the interior of the metrical line. There is a particularly effective device that can break into the established tempo of the line, thereby indicating, almost announcing, an important or revelatory moment. It is called the caesura. It is the structural or logical pause within and only within the line, and usually, but not always, within a metrical foot itself. This pause is not counted as part of the metrical pattern. So we go back to that line To a Nightingale by Keats, which I think we read before. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell. It's hard to read that quick, right? Forlorn, the very word is like a bell. You're not letting me linger on forlorn. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell. This is a caesura. This is a naturally occurring pause that occurs because of content within a given line. We've talked about how you want to make a pause at the end of one line as it carries on to the next, which is great. But sometimes there are moments in which we have to pause within the line because the content is sort of asking us to do that. So let's let's stop there and let's talk about this a little bit more. Maybe you can give me some feedback below. In fact, you will. Let's talk about how the tools that we've talked about in terms of rhyming or line breaks, how does this work for you? I know some of you really like to write in rhyming forms. Again, I'm not mad about that. I'm not. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you see rhyming functioning in your poems. Give me some feedback on that, and let's talk a little bit about it. I'd also like to see you, if you want, to talk about the way you think about line breaks and things like that. Have you considered it before? Is it something that just always felt functional? Am I now adding something to your expectations that's going to stress you out because now we have to think about a new thing? Sorry. Let's talk about that below. Let's get those comments below, and we'll have some good conversations over the next week. Remember, I also, and I posted this earlier, I am looking for poems for our next workshop. I don't have any yet, but it's early, so I'm okay. Let's try to get me something. As I said, I want to use the first 4 that I get, we'll use. So if I get more than that, we'll just kind of put those off for a future week. So trying to get them in earlier. I want to make sure that I've got things by Thursday night or Friday morning. So that'll give you the full weekend to go over things in anticipation of our class next week. So please do that. As I also mentioned, I have an exercise that I'm going to be posting after this video, so it's probably already up by the time you're seeing this, about playing with line breaks. I also have a writing prompt that I've got up for us for this week too. And it is a fun one about idioms, and so that's already posted, so maybe you've already seen it. But if you have any questions for me, please let me know, and I'd love to see comments below. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you in class next week, and I'll talk to you on Canvas throughout this week. Thanks.